There are moments in a Senate hearing when the disagreement is political, and then there are moments when the real issue becomes whether a witness is willing to answer basic questions under oath. In this hearing, one senator repeatedly pressed Dr. Shogun about her old social media posts, her views on masks, gun laws, religion, Donald Trump, and the Republican Party. What followed was an extraordinary exchange that quickly turned into a fight over transparency, credibility, and whether someone with controversial political views should be entrusted with a major position in the federal government. Stay with me, because the details of this exchange raise some serious questions. Welcome back to the Political Brief. If you appreciate political commentary that cuts through the talking points and actually examines what happened, make sure you subscribe, hit that like button, and let me know in the comments what you think. Now, let's get into this hearing.
Dr. Shogun, when you were here last year, a number of senators asked you, including me, a series of questions about articles you'd written, public statements you had made on social media that were, I have to say, pretty grossly partisan, and I thought offensive, and you and I went back and forth about it. After that, a number of us asked you questions for the record relating to these statements. I want to follow up on one of them. I, in particular, asked you to give us a full accounting of the public posts that you had made on Twitter. You had locked your Twitter account before you came before this committee. It had previously been public. I asked you to provide the public posts that had previously been available on Twitter because the ones that we have were pretty disturbing. You responded as follows, and I quote, "My personal Twitter account is comprised of posts about my mystery novels, events at the White House Historical Association, Pittsburgh sports teams, travels, and my dog," end quote. Is this an accurate statement?
Yes, Senator.
I just remind you, you're under oath. Is this an accurate statement?
Yes, Senator.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your Twitter posts then that I was asking you about. On February 18th, 2022, you posted on Twitter bemoaning the dropping of mask requirements for children, including those under the age of 5. Do you remember that post?
No, Senator. Those tweets were in my personal capacity.
No. I asked you, would you give all public posts that you had made on Twitter? You said no, effectively, and you said that your Twitter posts consisted of mystery novels, events at the White House Historical Association, Pittsburgh sports teams, travels, and my dog. And you just told me now under oath that you stood by that. So now let's talk about your Twitter posts. On February 18th, 2022, you posted bemoaning the fact that mask requirements for children under the age of 5, one of whom I happen to have, by the way, had been dropped. Is that a post about your dog or sports teams?
My social media is in my personal capacity,
Answer
Senator.
my question, please, because you've testified under oath that you only posted about your dog and sports teams and novels, and you also said you wouldn't give this committee any of your public posts. So, is your post on February 18th, 2022, bemoaning the lifting of mask requirements for children under the age of 5, who I might just ask, all of the data has said is extremely harmful to children, these mask requirements? We'll leave that aside for now. Is that a post about your dog or sports teams? Yes or no?
My social media is in my personal capacity, Senator.
Yes or no, Ms. Shogun? You are under oath before this committee, and I have to say, you have placed this issue squarely in record by repeatedly refusing to answer. Yes or no?
My social media is in my personal capacity, Senator.
So you're not answering my question. Let's talk about another post. 26th of May, 2022, you talk about an assault weapons ban, retweet a post, ban assault weapons now. Say you agree with this idea that you have to be a certain age to buy so-called assault weapons in America. Is that a post about sports teams or your dog or mystery novels?
My social media is in my personal capacity, Senator.
What about the post on January 5th of 2021 in which you say that Ted Cruz ought to stay in his own lane and not worry about what's going on in Pittsburgh? This is a reference, I think, to questions he had about the certification of the last election. Is that a post about your dog or sports teams or mystery novels?
My social media is in my personal capacity, Senator.
What about the post, you remember December 10th, 2020, where you said that you were hoping that President Trump would have his vetoes overridden, and you agreed with the post that he was a weak policy president? Is that a post about your dog or sports teams or mystery novels?
My social media is in my personal capacity.
What about your post on January 5th, 2021, in which you speculated that President Trump would pardon himself next, participating in a conversation about the certification of the Electoral College? Is that a post about sports teams or mystery novels or your work at the White House Historical Association?
My social media is in my personal capacity, Senator.
What about the post? Do you remember this one? I said we seem to be having an incredible case of amnesia, but maybe you remember this one. This is from December 3rd of 2021, in which you advise an individual who goes by Meg on social media that the Library of Congress, you advise this person to complain about religious flags that have been planted on the grounds of the Library of Congress, and you say that they ought to be removed. And you go on to give this person advice about how to complain and have them removed. Do you remember that post?
My social media is in my personal capacity.
Do you remember the post?
My social media is in my personal capacity, Senator.
I have to say, I have been here for 4 years in the Senate. I have never seen a witness stonewall like this before. Never. I've seen a lot. This is extraordinary. Do you remember this post? December 3rd, 2021.
My social media is in my personal capacity, Senator.
I mean, this is unbelievable. And you want to be the archivist of the United States. You lied to us under oath. You lied to us in your QFRs. You just lied to me a second ago under oath. And now you're sitting here stonewalling, not answering questions about public posts that you've made. Are you a lawyer, Ms. Shogun?
No, Senator.
Are you familiar with the Shirtliff case at the United States Supreme Court?
No, Senator, I'm not.
Well, in that case, the Supreme Court held that, in fact, it constitutes viewpoint discrimination for a government entity to remove religious flags from its property when it's opened up the property to allow other people to put flags on it. Exactly the question that you were addressing in your public posts on Twitter. You're giving legal advice, which you're not qualified to give, directly contrary to the United States Supreme Court. I just wonder, does this have to do with your view that you wrote about that the religious right is connected to the rise of anti-intellectualism in American politics? Is that why you said what you said about religious flags, that the religious right is a force for anti-intellectualism? Explain that to me.
No, Senator.
Do you stand by your comment that the religious right is part of the rise of anti-intellectualism in American politics?
Senator, that article was written. It was about how Republican presidents use common sense terminology to effectively communicate with Americans.
Yeah, in which you said that the rise of the religious right is part of the rise of anti-intellectualism in American politics. I just point out that's the article in which you say anti-intellectual. The title is Anti-Intellectualism in the Modern Presidency, Republican Populism. Very nonpartisan. Dr. Shogun, I'm going to ask you again, will you give to this committee your public posts on Twitter? Will you make them available to this committee?
My social media is in my personal capacity.
Mr. Chairman, I have to tell you, this is the most extraordinary thing I have seen in my brief time in the Senate. I have never seen a witness blatantly lie under oath like Dr. Shogun has just done to this committee, stonewalled this committee, and just repeatedly refused to answer my questions about her own posts that are in public. For these reasons, I will oppose your nomination, and I strongly, strongly urge this committee to take action on this and force this witness to own up to the fact that she is misleading us right now before our eyes, Mr. Chairman.
Right from the beginning, you can tell that the senator isn't simply trying to have a philosophical disagreement with Dr. Shogun. He's trying to establish something much more basic. What exactly did she say publicly, and why was she unwilling to provide those posts when the committee asked for them? That distinction matters. People are absolutely entitled to have political opinions. That's part of living in a free country. You can support Donald Trump, oppose Donald Trump, support Democrats, support Republicans, criticize Congress, criticize the Supreme Court, argue about guns, argue about masks, or argue about religion. None of those opinions automatically disqualify someone from public service. But when you're appearing before the United States Senate for a major government position, transparency matters. And that's where this exchange becomes much more serious. The senator points out that he had previously asked for Dr. Shogun's public Twitter posts. According to the exchange, she had characterized her account as being about things like mystery novels, White House Historical Association events, Pittsburgh sports, travel, and her dog. Now listen to the contradiction the senator believes he's identifying. He brings up a post from February 2022 concerning the lifting of mask requirements for young children. Then he asks a very simple question. Was that post about her dog, sports teams, or mystery novels? And instead of answering yes or no, Dr. Shogun repeatedly responds that her social media was in her personal capacity. That answer may be technically true, but it doesn't actually answer the question. And that's the part one think viewers need to pay attention to. Being a personal account doesn't make a public statement cease to exist. If you publicly posted something and that post is relevant to your nomination, saying that it was made in your personal capacity doesn't explain what you said or why you said it. Imagine you're applying for a senior position in government, and a Senate committee asks you about a public statement you made. You don't necessarily have to agree with the senator asking the question. You don't even have to apologize for your political beliefs. But answer the question. That's what I think is frustrating about this exchange. The senator then moves to another post, this time involving an assault weapons ban. Again, the question is whether this was part of the public record that she had previously described as consisting largely of personal interests like sports and books. Once again, the response is essentially that her social media was personal. And at that point, the hearing starts moving away from policy and into credibility. Because if the committee is asking about specific public statements, repeatedly refusing to address the actual statements can create the impression that you're avoiding the substance. Now, let's be fair here. There's an important distinction between having a political opinion and being dishonest about having one. If Dr. Shogun believed in stronger gun restrictions, she could simply say so. If she opposed President Trump, she could say so. If she believed masks should have remained mandatory for young children, she could defend that position. If she criticized Senator Ted Cruz, she could explain why. If she had concerns about religious displays or religious flags on government property, she could explain those concerns. That's politics. What becomes problematic is when a nominee is asked repeatedly about statements attributed to her, and the response never actually addresses whether she made them or what she meant. The senator then brings up a post concerning Ted Cruz, where she allegedly told him to stay in his own lane while discussing the 2020 election certification. Again, the response is that the social media account was personal. But here's my concern as a conservative. Government officials don't suddenly become non-political just because they're sitting behind a government desk. Their past statements can tell us something about how they view the country, the Constitution, the public, and the institutions they're being asked to serve. And that applies to people on both sides. If a conservative nominee had spent years attacking Democrats, calling them enemies of America, or making extreme statements about government institutions, I would expect senators to ask about those statements too. The standard should not be different simply because we like or dislike the nominee. That's why transparency should be the standard. Then the senator brings up another statement involving President Trump. According to the exchange, Dr. Shogun had expressed hope that Trump's vetoes would be overridden and agreed with the characterization of Trump as a weak policy president. Again, that is not illegal. It is not even particularly unusual. People criticize presidents every single day. But if you're being nominated to become archivist of the United States, the Senate has a legitimate interest in understanding your political history and your attitude toward major political figures and institutions. And then comes another post involving the 2020 election and speculation that President Trump could pardon himself. This is where the hearing starts becoming particularly politically charged, because we're talking about one of the most controversial periods in modern American political history. The 2020 election, the Electoral College certification, January 6th, presidential pardons, and constitutional questions surrounding the transfer of power are all subjects that continue to divide Americans. So if a nominee made public comments about those issues, I don't think it's unreasonable for senators to ask about them. But again, the key issue is whether the nominee answers. Then we get to perhaps the most interesting part of the exchange, the discussion about religious flags at the Library of Congress. The senator points to a post where Dr. Shogun allegedly advised someone on social media about complaining over religious flags on Library of Congress property. He then argues that this raises a constitutional issue. And this is where I think the hearing moves beyond partisan politics and into a legitimate constitutional discussion. The First Amendment protects religious freedom. It also places limits on government discrimination based on viewpoint. If a government property opens a public forum for people to express themselves, the government can't simply decide that one viewpoint is acceptable while another is forbidden because officials don't like the message. That's a serious constitutional principle. Now, whether Dr. Shogun's specific social media advice was legally correct is another question entirely. And the senator makes that point by bringing up a Supreme Court case involving religious flags and viewpoint discrimination. That is why nominees should be careful when giving legal or constitutional advice publicly. You don't have to be a lawyer to express an opinion. Americans do it every day. But when that opinion concerns constitutional rights and the authority of the federal government, it deserves scrutiny. The senator then connects the issue to an article attributed to Dr. Shogun discussing anti-intellectualism and the religious right. And this is where I think the political philosophy underneath the entire hearing becomes visible, because there's a much larger argument happening here. What does the nominee actually believe about conservatives? What does she believe about the religious right? What does she believe about Donald Trump? What does she believe about guns? What does she believe about government restrictions? And perhaps most importantly, would those beliefs influence how she performs her duties? Those are legitimate questions for a Senate confirmation hearing. Now, I want to make something very clear. I don't believe someone should be rejected from government simply because they have criticized conservatives. That's not the America we should want. The government should not be staffed exclusively by people who agree with whoever is currently in power. But at the same time, we shouldn't pretend political beliefs don't matter at all. If someone has publicly spent years describing one side of the political spectrum as dangerous, ignorant, anti-intellectual, or fundamentally wrong, senators are justified in asking whether that worldview could affect their judgment. And that's especially relevant for a position involving the nation's historical records. The National Archives isn't supposed to belong to Republicans. It isn't supposed to belong to Democrats. It belongs to the American people. Our historical records should be preserved honestly, regardless of which political party produced them. That's why I think the nominees' responses are more important than the political labels being thrown around. The senator eventually becomes visibly frustrated and says he has never seen a witness stonewall the Senate in this way. He goes so far as to accuse Dr. Shogun of lying under oath. Now, that's an extremely serious accusation, and I think we should be careful with it. A senator saying someone lied under oath is not the same thing as a court establishing perjury as a fact. We shouldn't confuse an accusation made during a heated hearing with a final legal finding. But politically, the damage can still be enormous, because confirmation hearings are fundamentally about trust. If senators believe a nominee isn't answering direct questions, that can destroy confidence in the nomination regardless of whether a criminal offense occurred. And here's the bigger lesson for conservatives. We have to be consistent. If a Republican nominee gets grilled over old tweets, we shouldn't suddenly claim that old tweets don't matter. If a Democratic nominee gets grilled over old tweets, we shouldn't suddenly claim that political opinions are disqualifying. The principle should be simple. Tell the truth. Answer the questions. Defend your record. And let the Senate decide. That's how the process is supposed to work. What I find particularly revealing in this exchange is that the senator doesn't actually need Dr. Shogun to agree with him. He doesn't need her to suddenly become a Trump supporter. He doesn't need her to abandon her views on guns. He doesn't need her to change her opinion about masks. He doesn't need her to agree with conservatives on religion. He wants her to acknowledge the statements and explain them. That's a completely different demand. And if you're a nominee sitting in that chair, there is a strategic lesson here. Sometimes the safest answer isn't an evasive answer. If you made the post, say you made it. If you still believe it, explain why. If you've changed your mind, explain what changed. If the statement was taken out of context, provide the context. If you made a mistake, own it. That is far more convincing than repeating the same sentence over and over again. Because when a witness keeps saying, "My social media is in my personal capacity," while the senator is asking about specific public statements, eventually the audience starts wondering what they're not being told. And that is exactly where this hearing became politically explosive. From my perspective, as a right-wing patriot, this isn't ultimately about whether someone has liberal opinions. America was built on the idea that people can disagree. The real issue is accountability. We have created a political culture where public officials sometimes believe they can say whatever they want, delete it later, lock their accounts, and then claim it shouldn't be considered when they're being evaluated for public office. I don't think that's reasonable. If you put something publicly on the internet, you should assume that history can find it. That applies to Republicans. That applies to Democrats. That applies to presidents. That applies to senators. And it applies to nominees. You don't get to rewrite your public record simply because the political environment has changed. At the same time, conservatives should be careful not to turn every controversial opinion into a disqualification. America doesn't need ideological purity tests. It needs competent people who understand the Constitution, respect the law, and can perform their responsibilities without allowing personal political preferences to override their duties. And that's ultimately the question I would have for any nominee sitting in that chair. Can you separate your personal political beliefs from the responsibilities of the office? If the answer is yes, then explain how. If you've changed your views, tell us. If you stand by them, defend them. But don't pretend the public record doesn't exist. Because the American people deserve to know who is asking for the power to serve inside their government. And when you're dealing with the nation's historical archives, that responsibility becomes even more important. History should not be rewritten to make one political side look better. The facts should be preserved. The documents should remain accessible. The records should tell the story, even when that story is uncomfortable. That's what the National Archives should represent. So after watching this exchange, I think the biggest question isn't simply whether Dr. Shogun had controversial opinions. Of course she did. The bigger question is whether the committee received straightforward answers when it asked about those opinions. And that's something every American, regardless of party, should care about. Because if a government nominee cannot answer basic questions about their own public record, why should the Senate, or the American people, be expected to simply trust them? That's where I'll leave it. What do you think? Was the senator right to keep pressing Dr. Shogun about her old social media posts? Or did this hearing go too far into a nominee's personal political opinions? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more political hearings, breaking political developments, and conservative commentary without the usual spin, subscribe to the Political Brief, hit the like button, and turn on notifications. We'll see you in the next one.